Good evening, comrades. Welcome to a special session in the LLA Education series. It's been just over a year since the war in Ukraine has started, and we thought it's really important to take stock. Tens of thousands have died already. There's no end in sight. There have been a few meetings of the left on this one-year anniversary, as you'd expect. I think most of them, though, are either taking sides with the Ukraine, which is what the establishment media and the government is doing with the NATO and the US, where we've seen, for example, a demonstration of the Stop the War coalition had a small group of people from the Ukraine Solidarity campaign going to the front, calling arm, arm, arm Ukraine, calling on the British state to send weapons, and really they were more marching for war. I was quite shocked by that. So we have those on the left who take the side of the Ukraine and NATO and the US. On the other hand, I think we also have wrong ideas on the other side of the more Stalinist left, perhaps, if you want to call it that, around George Galloway. We think they have to support Putin and Russia because it's somehow the smaller, lesser evil. And they present, and that's a sort of new one, I've been a bit surprised about it, they are presenting states like India, Russia, China, and Iran as being held up as examples of a possible multipolar world order that could take on US hegemony. And I have to say, I find that quite horrific that these clearly anti-working class, horrific regimes are being presented as some kind of alternative. So tonight we want to have a look at what we think is from a different perspective, which is from the international working class perspective. There are differences in the LLA and on our steering committee, but I think we agree on a few things, and I just want to briefly outline them as we go into this meeting. So a general agreement, I think we entirely reject the invasion of Ukraine, and we do not defend or side with Putin. But we understand that this invasion cannot be explained or cannot be understood without the context of the war conducted by the Ukrainian government against the Donbass and the Donetsk region since 2014. We also agree that this is a proxy war pushed along by the US and NATO, and that the real target is China. And this would create a real prospect of World War III at the age of, and in the age of nuclear weapons, an outlook which is even more horrific than the First World Wars. We do not believe that we have to take sides between two butchers, the US and Russia. I think that's our key position. But if anything, the main enemy is at home for us. So tonight we want to look at this question from this different viewpoint, an internationalist viewpoint that starts from the interest of the working class. We, as always, we welcome debate, we welcome different views, we welcome questions. That's what we're all about. We've got 3 speakers lined up. We're still waiting for Hanna Danilovich. I hope she's joining us very soon. She is a representative of the Belarus Electrician Union, REP. With us at the moment are Roger Silverman and Kevin Bean, both members of the LLA steering committee. And we're going to start with Roger, and everybody's got 15 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions and debate. Roger, please.
Right. Hi, comrades. I'd like to start by reminding comrades, 30 years ago, the world's capitalists were rejoicing at the collapse of the USSR and celebrating the end of history. And since then, history has given its own riposte in the shape of the deepest slump since the 1930s, the deadliest pandemic since 1918, the first European wars since 1945, and the closest threat of nuclear Armageddon since 1962. War for socialists is always the greatest test and challenge. And this war, as for instance, most graphically in 1914, it sent shockwaves throughout the labor movement and its sharply polarized opinion. And at such times, above all, we need to keep a clear head. Have you noticed? Britain only ever fights against cartoon cutout evil monsters. Before Hitler, it was the Kaiser. After Hitler, it was General Galtieri, Milosevic, Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, and now Vladimir Putin. And the other point, imperialist powers never fight wars in their own interests. They always come heroically to the rescue of innocent, defenseless victims. Little Serbia, little Belgium, little Poland, the poor Falkland Islanders. Now it's Ukraine. Now, we all feel horrified at the invasion of Ukraine. Of all the satellites and former constituent countries of the USSR, none has been more unstable than Ukraine, which over 3 decades has suffered economic collapse, coups and counter-coups, secession, annexation, civil war, and now a full-scale war. This, as I've said, though, is not the first imperialist war fought on the pretext of defense of the rights of small nations. I want to quote Trotsky, who warns that an imperialist war, no matter in what corner it begins, will be waged not for national independence, but for a redivision of the world in the interests of separate cliques of finance capital. And he went on to say that Marxists are not concerned with episodic shifts of military fronts during a new brawl of the imperialists, but with the uprising of the proletariat and its victory over all the imperialists. Now, Russia is a secondary regional imperialist power, today just as it was when Lenin called it a prison house of nations, a regional imperialist power vying for scraps in the scramble for spheres of influence. The Putin regime is a parasitic kleptocracy founded on wholesale plunder of the corpse of the Soviet state. Putin's belated claim to be fighting fascism is belied by his patronage of far-right forces worldwide. His purported defense of the rights of the peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk to self-determination is utterly cynical. Tens of thousands of Chechens died fighting Putin's forces for that very same right. He resorts to Russian Orthodox medievalism by rubbishing Ukraine's very national identity, dismissing it as an artificial construct created by Bolshevik communist Russia. This was a reference to the Bolsheviks' policy after the revolution of liberating the enslaved nations of Tsarist Russia and granting them statehood and autonomy up to and including the unconditional right of secession. Behind his message, we are ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine, lies the threat of extinction of Ukraine as a nation in the worst tradition of Tsarist tyranny. And those who argue that as a weaker power, Russia must be defended against US imperialism are repeating the catastrophic mistake of those in 1914 who used similar arguments for the defense of backward Russia against the might of German imperialism. Lenin and Trotsky resisted their overwhelming pressure and upheld the banner of proletarian internationalism. Now, Putin's timing is prompted by 2 factors. First is the conspicuous decline of US imperialist power, as demonstrated by its defeat in Iraq, Iran being now the dominant power there, its abstention from involvement in the Syrian civil war, and most graphically by its rout in Afghanistan. Putin calculated that NATO would not directly confront Russia militarily in Ukraine any more than they had in Chechnya or Georgia or Crimea. It's fighting a proxy war, which we will fight to the last Ukrainian. Putin is desperate to assert his waning authority also as it begins to crumble at home, alarmed by the recent full-scale uprisings that he's only barely succeeded in suppressing in Belarus and Kazakhstan, Russia's 2 closest allies, and also at the growing mood of discontent within Russia itself, which he rules solely by thuggery and fear. So there can be no excuses and no alibis for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it is not irrational or paranoid. Following the collapse of the USSR, the USA and its allies had imposed on Russia the most draconic and humiliating defeat and constantly baited Russia with brazen provocations. The Ukraine war is a preliminary skirmish. NATO is preparing the way for a future world war against China, and that's why it is so intent on first weakening China's nuclear-armed potential ally. In the last 30 years, NATO has expanded over 1,000 miles eastwards. It has placed anti-ballistic launch systems on Russia's borders and conducted countless military exercises. The objective of Ukrainian membership of NATO was formally adopted in 2008, reaffirmed in 2014, and repeated both in August 2021, when Biden and Zelensky formally declared the admission of Ukraine to NATO as, quote, the immediate aim, and then again in November 2021, when NATO announced, again, quote, we reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. Now, NATO's encirclement of Russia was calculated to provoke from Russia just the same reaction as that of the USA to the sighting of Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. In that case, sorry, I've lost my place. In that case, the USA had wisely agreed to a deal under which its own missiles were discreetly withdrawn from Turkey. Warnings against the expansion of NATO into former Soviet satellite states, and specifically Ukraine, had been sounded by almost the entire diplomatic establishment, by proven hawks like Henry Kissinger, remember him? George Kennan, Robert McNamara, Paul Nitzer, Richard Pipes, Robert Gates, former defense secretaries, former US ambassadors, and even the current CIA director, Bill Burns. They spelt out, and I'm using direct quotes here, that for Russians, what happens in Ukraine is an existential matter. What would we do if the Russians established a force in Mexico? Everything we are doing seems to be aimed at prolonging the fighting. We will fight to the last Ukrainian for Ukrainian independence. Expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. The beginning of a new Cold War, a tragic mistake. These are all direct quotes from some of the personalities that I just mentioned. Now, in flagrant disregard of these warnings and of the undertakings previously made to Gorbachev in 1991 in return for Russia's withdrawal of 400,000 troops from East Germany, which was negotiated as a quid pro quo for Germany's reunification, NATO had swallowed up former Warsaw Pact countries and even former constituent parts of the USSR, 14 in total, systematically bringing a hostile military alliance right up against Russia's borders and openly preparing the incorporation of Ukraine itself. The USA has withdrawn unilaterally from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It has armed and trained the armies of former Warsaw Pact countries. It's held regular joint military exercises inside Ukraine, including naval exercises in the Black Sea involving 32 countries. When the Russian ambassador to the USA complained that the situation is extremely dangerous, an existential threat for Russia, the US Secretary of State's retort was, there will be no change. Now, the former CIA director and former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, has admitted in so many words that, again, a direct quote, the USA, backed by the whole of NATO, is in a long proxy war with Russia, with Ukraine as the battlefield. Remember, the USA and the EU have promoted anti-Russian color revolutions in a range of countries formerly within its sphere of influence, including twice in Ukraine. The 2014 and 2015 Minsk agreements, brokered by France and Germany, had offered a ceasefire and guaranteed autonomous status within Ukraine to the Russian-speaking peoples of Donbass. But these were unilaterally violated by the regime in Kiev, which encouraged the incorporation into the Ukrainian army of openly fascist paramilitary forces as autonomous units in a civil war in which some 14,000 lives were lost. The USA, UK, and Canada trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops. The CIA trained the Azov Battalion and right-wing paramilitaries. and on the eve of the Russian invasion, Kiev had massed 130,000 troops on the borders of Donbass. So the USA and NATO have pursued a policy of calculated provocation, not intervening directly, but engaging in a protracted, covert proxy war, just as they did during the 1980s in supporting the Mujahideen when Russia was at war in Afghanistan. So yes, of course, the Ukrainian people have a right to self-determination. We support their right to defend themselves. Similarly, though, neither Washington nor Moscow nor Kiev have the right to determine the status of the disputed territories of Donbass and Crimea. They too have a democratic right of self-determination. They've been promised autonomy within a united Ukraine. The population of Crimea are mostly Russians who suddenly found themselves Ukrainian citizens within a unified Soviet Union due solely to the whim of a capricious Khrushchev who personally gifted it to his Ukrainian satraps in 1954. Donbass was the industrial powerhouse of the USSR, and its inhabitants, mostly Russian-speaking descendants of workers historically transported there from elsewhere in Soviet times. So it's a matter solely for the populations of those regions to decide their status for themselves. The war could be ended tomorrow by 2 points. 1, a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality, and 2, genuine self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and Crimea. Now, popular outrage and protest are perfectly legitimate responses to this invasion, but the task of socialists is to expose the truth, that this war is just one expression of the crisis of world capitalism, and that our allies are the workers of Russia, Ukraine, and the world, and that the best help we can give them is to overthrow our own capitalists. So I think our watchwords should be Russia, hands off Ukraine, immediate withdrawal of occupation forces, no trust in NATO, oppose all sanctions, arms supplies, and escalation of the war, solidarity with the people of Ukraine in defense of their democratic rights, self-determination for the peoples of Donbass and Crimea on the basis of a genuinely democratic referendum, mutual demilitarization of the border territories on either side, and above all, unity of the workers of Russia and Ukraine to overthrow their corrupt reactionary oppressors. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent introduction. There's been a few disagreements, as we'd expect, in the chat already. Comrades, please click raise hand, then you can come back later. Roger, a few people question the characterization of Russia as imperialist, but I'm sure we'll get to that in the discussion, and comrades will come into that. I'd also say instead of no trust in NATO, I would say abolish NATO. I don't think this should remain an organization and should be dismantled pronto. But let's get to our next speaker, Hanna Danilovich. Sorry, hello, comrade. She is the official representative of the Electricians Union in Belarus, REP. And perhaps you could introduce yourself a little bit before you start and explain your union has disaffiliated from the yellow unions, I understand.
Good evening to everyone. As Tina just introduced me, I'm an official international representative of the Radio Electronic Workers Union in Belarus. I've been living and working in the UK for quite a few years now, and basically trying to promote Belarusian cause here. Well, our union disaffiliated from the official unions quite a long time ago. That was actually in 2003. When the authorities started not just stepping on union freedoms, the official unions became the only possible unions for people. They're basically enforced on the workers. And the last straw for us was when President Lukashenko decided to abolish the elections for the official Union Federation and instead to appoint one of his deputy chiefs as the chairman of the Belarusian Trade Union Federation. So that's when REP decided to leave the yellow unions and be independent. And then in 2009, we joined the Belarusian Congress of Democratic Trade Unions, an alternative democratic association of unions who were not agreeing with just being a transmission belt, which is how yellow unions in Belarus operate. Fought for workers' rights in Belarus. We defended people against unfair dismissal. We represented people in employment tribunals. We fought for fair pay, decent working conditions, health and safety at work. And since 2020 until April last year, we also helped those who were unfairly prosecuted for expressing their democratic right to protest after the elections, which were held in August 2020. Last year, on the 7th of April 2022, REP was named an extremist organization by the Belarusian KGB. And on the 19th of April, our leaders were arrested along with the rest of the leadership of all independent trade unions and the leaders of the Belarusian Congress of Democratic Trade Unions. They were held in prison for quite some time without charge. And then they were charged with absolutely obnoxious charges of forming an extremist organizations, leading an extremist organizations. The worst was the charge that they participated in actions aimed at causing harm to the national security of Belarus, something which wasn't even in the penal code, which was invented pretty quickly. Some of our activists were jailed for simply insulting President Lukashenko in the way they didn't even understand how. So that was partially, as we think, it was partially the reaction on the support of Ukrainian workers by Belarusian Congress of Democratic Trade Unions for anti-war declarations that independent trade unions of Belarus published officially on the websites, well, which unfortunately you can't now reach. Those are closed. We've always supported Russian and Ukrainian workers, not always the governments. We showed a lot of solidarity. We had solidarity campaigns with Ukrainian workers a few years ago when the government of Ukraine started changing the labor code and worsening the working conditions in Ukraine. And we absolutely opposed this war. And that's what's happening right now in Belarus. Activists and leaders are jailed, and independent trade union movement is declared terrorism just for doing what trade unions do, protecting workers' rights. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. It's quite interesting to hear your views, because you obviously, for us, the main enemy is obviously the British state and NATO involved and stuff. And there's a lot of pressure on working class people in Britain to support the war against Russia, to take the sides of Ukraine. And there's a lot of pressure on trade unions and other organizations to do that. I would have thought in Belarus it's exactly the opposite. Do working class organizations get a lot of pressure? Is the media very clearly pro-Russia? Is it difficult for you to take an independent working class position?
Well, the independent working class position is prosecuted in Belarus, and the official unions do support the war because they do not see themselves separate from the state. They have always been a part of management rather than being unions as they should be. So yes, they do support that, and whoever decides to challenge the established view is jailed on charges which have very little to do with reality.
So an anti-war position is one that would get you into real trouble at the moment.
Well, one of the elements of that, yes, the authorities in Belarus have tried to demolish independent unions since the Belarusian Congress of Democratic Unions was established. And the latest anti-war declarations by the Congress leadership, I think they became one of the reasons why they decided to declare independent unions illegal. And two of the unions, including the union I represent, were basically named extremists and terrorists. So yes, anti-war support is one of the causes, yes.
And can you clarify your unions, or generally the sort of an independent working class organization, how they view the idea of sanctions against Putin, against Russian oligarchs? Do they help? Do they make just matters worse for the Russian working class and perhaps the Belarus working class? How do they affect you?
Well, the Belarusian working class is obviously affected quite negatively because, yes, sanctions against Russian oligarchs don't touch Belarus. So people just see them, okay, well, that's another oligarch can't go and, have a holiday in Spain or Italy. So it doesn't really touch them. The sanctions against enterprises, yes, they do affect people because many enterprises in Belarus, most of them are either openly state-owned or they have a massive state stake in them, sometimes reaching 99%. So they're de facto state-owned as well. So the sanctions do hit people very badly because Belarusian people have always had modest salaries, to say it mildly, and they don't have any financial buffer that would take them through any period. So right now, many companies are forced into working part-time. People obviously are paid part-time, although they are employed full-time, so there is massive underemployment in Belarus. Whoever can leave, they all leave. Although it seems that Europe is not as hospitable to Belarusians. It's very hard for people to get working visas or get even refugee status in Europe. I mean, Poland is helpful with that, and so are Baltic states, but well, not much beyond that. And that's how sanctions are. I mean, right now, the average wages in Belarus are dropping. Real incomes are dropping because Belarusian ruble is, well, it's not convertible to start with, but right now the exchange rate with dollar is just appalling. So people have massive difficulties paying the bills. And that's how workers live. Yes, and that's those who have jobs, really. And we've seen, especially in smaller towns, where, say, that enterprise against which the sanctions were introduced was the main employer. So if that was forced to close, many people revert back to basically subsistence farming, because that's the only way to survive.
Mm.
It's either that or emigration.
Mm. And do you think that the sanctions actually pose a danger of shoring up support for Lukashenko if people are suffering because of those Western sanctions? That, you know, that's often the case then, that actually the regime is bolstered by them. Do you get that impression?
People of Belarus will hold on, and they will support sanctions as long as that helps the regime change. So far, it's been 2.5 years, and there's been no change, really. Belarus was already called before the International Labour Organization last year, and they were questioned in regards with the violation of the workers' rights. Right now, they need this, basically this week, they have to present their response, what's been done to change the situation. Well, actually nothing has been done. No sentences were reversed. It's actually getting worse and worse. For people are being arrested for comments on Facebooks made 3 years ago, for example. People being arrested for charges which are just it's honestly, it's really hard to explain. Well, so sometimes it's just absolutely not normal. Okay, families are being broken. So that's what reality Belarusian workers face now. And yes, the idea was to get people scared, and people are scared. Because even those people who have, say, relatives in Europe, it's very hard for them to help, because most of the cards, most of the payment systems don't work. People can't transfer funds into Belarus to help. That's the part of the sanctions. Of course, yeah, sure, there'll be fewer taxes paid to the Belarusian regime, but it's pure taxes paid at what expense? So far, these sanctions were very partial. And there are still companies, Western companies, who continue working with Belarus, either through proxies or through other channels, but they do continue to do so because they need Belarusian raw materials. They will work with Belarus, whatever happens. So unless sanctions will actually lead to regime change, right now they're only making the economic situation worse.
I mean, there's a school of thought that says that sanctions were never meant to lead to any kind of regime change, but to, sort of demoralize the population, etc., so that if somebody from outside comes in, then it looked like a savior. But that actually they are designed to destroy the working class, which is, in our view, the only real force that can lead to a democratic revolution from below. We don't think it's a good idea. The US comes in and puts a new dictator in charge of Belarus. They have no interest in democracy. It's the people from below, isn't it, that have to make revolution. And if they're weakened by sanctions, that's not going to. Well,
they do have to, and and people who call themselves the new opposition, they are so very much pro-sanctions.
Are they?
They are for more and more and more and more sanctions. They just basically cruise in the European Parliament, going, please go, heavier sanctions, please do more, please do more. Well, to what end?
Yeah.
Honestly, to what end? Because these people are not in Belarus. They're very comfortably in Western Europe. So to what end? And when we talk to comrades who are back in Belarus, and they just basically saying, well, we can't really do anything because the leaders are arrested, all the accounts were arrested. You say the wrong word, you're arrested. And then on top of that, we need to think about survival partially because of sanctions. So yeah.
So the new opposition believes it will be brought in at some stage, probably.
Well, they believe that at some point regime will just collapse, or the EU and the US will just make it collapse, and they will be brought in as victors. They've already, I mean, considering how detailed their cabinet is now, they created their own cabinet. Right. Of people who were never elected, by the way. There were no parliamentary elections in Belarus, so but these people basically decided, well, we now represent Belarus, and they gave each other nice ministerial positions, and creating committees and subcommittees and subcommittees on subcommittees, basically mimicking the Belarusian authorities. Getting ready to be put in place, and at the same time basically seeing everybody else, including the democratic unions, as either subservient to them, and if those unions do not want to be subservient to them, well, that's competition, and competition should be suppressed.
Yeah. Fascinating talking to you, Hanna. Thank you so much for these insights. It's really good to hear from the people below and how they suffer from sanction, etc. We're going to have one more speaker from the top. That's Kevin Bean, and then we're going to open up for questions and comments. And I hope, Hanna, you'll be also staying with us. So if comrades have some questions and comments, you can answer them. Thank you very much for that. It was very interesting. Kevin Bean is our last speaker. You have 15 minutes, comrade.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Thanks to the first two comrades. I don't intend to repeat quite a lot of the areas that are common between Roger and I, but there are a couple of things that I would sort of emphasize and possibly take up some differences of emphasis, and some of the comments that I've seen in the chat, although I'm afraid I don't always follow that as quickly as I should. What I would like to begin with, I suppose, is an understanding of the broader geopolitics that Roger began with. And I think that in much of the discussions on the left and the other areas, we've tended to see the isolation of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine as really quite separate from these wider geopolitical conceptions. And Roger quite correctly placed that in the role of the United States and of NATO, particularly the relative decline of American imperialism, its need to shore up its position globally, and of course its broader sets of competitions with China. The AUKUS agreement that we've seen heralded today is just one part of that. So American imperialism feels itself under threat. It feels that its position needs to be consolidated, and it sees regional powers such as Russia as a threat to that. It also sees similar regional powers such as Iran, potentially India, and of course China, although China is now, I think, moving towards a fully fledged imperialist position and quite a dominant position in Asia, and expanding into Africa as well, and further afield. So we have, I think, a situation that resembles in many ways the situation in the late 19th and early 20th century, with great powers, some imperialists, some merging into imperialism. And that's the way to look at this. The expansion of NATO and the aims of NATO and the United States in relation to Russia, I think, are quite clear. They are, at the very least, to weaken Russia, possibly, as Zbigniew Brzezinski suggested as long ago as the 1970s, some form of dismemberment, certainly some form of weakening, turning Russia essentially into a client state, a puppet state, and particularly one that could be exploited for its mineral resources. in that way. So the tensions that have arisen through quite a conscious strategy by the United States and its allies of undermining Russia's near abroad and attempting, I think, to weaken its power. This, I think, is not just a situation confined to Russia in terms of American policy, but it also is one that they've adopted towards Iran and may adopt towards other powers as well. This, I think, fits into the scenario in relation to China, because China will, I think, attempt to develop a series of alliances. Some of them will be tighter and closer than others, and will certainly see anything that strengthens the United States as weakening its position. So we have a pattern of great power rivalry, which is, I suppose, really quite familiar to us. If we wanted to think of the analogy, we might think about the analogy between Austria-Hungary and Russia, or between Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, and China. And Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century obviously needed alliances and could regard Austria-Hungary as a potential ally, a useful ally, but also a sense of some weakness. I won't go too much into the diplomatic history of that period, but I think the analogy is quite a valid one, and one that illustrates both the strategic bind that the United States has, but also some of the options that are open to China as well. Roger, I think, has been was quite clear in terms of outlining the patterns of expansion. Also, I think the role of NATO in essentially containing and encircling Russia as part of its wider containment policy directed towards China. And again, the eastern expansion of NATO, the positioning of troops, missiles, and so on, all, I think, being very clearly developed. Also, the placing of what are effectively puppet regimes through color revolutions in some of those surrounding countries, and also the argument that this might be a strategy to be used in Russia itself. The war may, one of the war aims, I think, of the United States is clearly regime change, and that might come about through the elements of the Russian state apparat who might be induced to overthrow Putin if the war becomes a problem. That's again a possible a possible American strategy. So we've established, I think, the broader geopolitical parameters. We also, I think, have to look at those parameters and now as they stand in relation to Ukraine and to Russia itself, and particularly the type of arguments that are being deployed by the allies of the United States, by the United States itself. And again, Roger draws on the very accurate comparisons between the First World War and this current situation. Gallant Belgium, plucky Serbia, small countries whose democracy is under attack. It was partly it was by accident because I didn't know the war was going to occur. But I was in the Belgian city of Louvain, which comrades may remember was subject to fairly horrific German atrocities in the First World War. And I went to Louvain for some academic work, but I went to see an exhibition in Louvain of wartime propaganda, both German war propaganda and Allied propaganda. And what struck me about the propaganda deployed about the burning or the rape of Louvain or Leuven was that it had the same sort of character that we have today, and that the attempt was made to turn what was essentially the imperialist war of the First World War into a war for democracy and for freedom. And indeed, that type of mythology is still one that's readily used. Only yesterday, Rishi Sunak, when he's consummating the AUKUS agreement on submarines, refers to the close alliances between Australia, America, and the United Kingdom, and talks about the wars for democracy, in which he includes the First World War. So that rhetoric and that mobilization, I think, has obscured much of the reality of this war. Certainly, if we look at the propaganda in Britain, the war has been reduced simply to a defense of Ukrainian democracy against Russian expansion. And again, Roger's points about the nature of Vladimir Putin. I think Roger's quite right. I'm not sure that Britain has ever fought anybody who's at least not a devil or an ogre or indeed a threat to civilization. Britain never fights normal wars. There are always crusades and existential wars for the defense of freedom. If again, we look at the new updated British initiative, the foreign policy initiative strategy that was discussed yesterday in the Commons, we can see that same sort of language being deployed. So what position should we adopt towards this? And I want to address one particular set of problems which have occurred. And that's the issue of self-determination, and indeed the relationship of self-determination to our general demands. Now, for many people on the left, many of them are quite sincere, I think, in this. They've argued that the right of self-determination for Ukraine and the defense of Ukraine is, in a sense, the primary issue. Now, for some of the people who've adopted this position, I think they're being thoroughly dishonest in this, and many of them are just simply people who sort of jumped on the bandwagon and have really just mirrored the propaganda of NATO. However, if we look at the position historically, I don't think that self-determination is either an absolute right or an absolute demand for socialists. And what we always have to do is to look at two patterns. One is the general imperialist character and the characterization of any war, any conflict. But the second one is what is in the interests of the working class. And that's where the analogy with the First World War, I think, comes in. And that is that simply to make those analogies, to make those demands for self-determination obscures much of the real character of the war, and can put us as socialists in the social imperialist camp, in the same sort of camp of those people who rallied to the side of the imperialist powers of Britain, France, in the First World War. When we're defending abstract rights of self-determination and suggesting that we have to give complete and uncritical support to the Ukrainian regime, what we're doing, I think, is putting ourselves in that camp. Now, there's another issue of self-determination here, which also obscures or indeed becomes a problem, which is the issue of those comrades who argue that they don't support the regime, but they do support the Ukrainian people. And they do, in a sense, then try to distinguish between the state, which they recognize, for example, that Zelensky is, very much a creature of the oligarchs, that he's far from a democrat, and indeed that he is, represents the same sort of interest in Ukraine as other capitalist politicians. But what these comrades then do is to, I think, come up with an abstraction, which is to give support to the Ukrainian working class, and in a sense, separate that struggle out. But they separate the reality. They don't, for example, pose a working class solution of opposition to the Zelensky regime, the emphasis on the main enemy being at home. But they, in a sense, blur that distinction, that the support for the Ukrainian working class is the same as the support for the Ukrainian state and for its military defense. So I don't think that we can line ourselves up behind the Zelensky regime. We also can't line ourselves up behind abstractions about the defense of Ukraine in the same way. We have to recognize that Ukraine is, in a sense, being used by NATO, by American imperialism in its wider campaign, and that sort of victory would not be a victory for the working class. There's also, I think, the question that Roger raised, fairly clearly about the situation in the Donbass, and indeed in the Crimea, where the national allegiances and the demands of the population there are at the very least unclear. But it's certainly true, as Roger has explained, that the Crimea historically was not only populated by Russian speakers and those who identified with Russia, but up until the 1950s was part of the Russian Republic as part of the USSR. And the same is also true in the Donbass in that way. I won't get into the the historical development of that, but it's very clear that as an exercise in self-determination, the existing borders of the Ukrainian state and its patterns do not correspond, I think, adequately to expressions of self-determination. But I use the slogan, "The main enemy is at home," and I would apply that also to Russia as well. My characterization of Russia is not as an imperialist power. It's an expansionist power. It's a power that wants to be regionally dominant. And although Roger does draw on Trotsky's characterization of Russia in 1914, I think that there are problems both in seeing Russia purely as imperialist, not just in terms of a sort of magnitude of power, but for example, in terms of its economic relationships. I wouldn't use imperialism, and I don't think Roger is using it in a sloppy sense, but I wouldn't use it just simply to talk about a country that wants to dominate others. So I think we have to be clear that the aggressors in this sense are American imperialism, but Russia is also a regional power that's trying to maintain its position. Just as I would have argued that before the First World War, it was British imperialism that was trying to contain German imperialism. And although Germany launched the first strike, as it were, the real causes and the real provocations for that war, as with this war, are the dominant imperialism, which is that of America. So I think we can give no support to the Russian regime. And again, Roger has explained that. I think comrades are quite well aware about the nature of that regime. I think very few people have illusions in Putin. Certainly arguments in the right-wing press that the left are somehow attempting to revive the Soviet Union, I think are really quite nonsensical. Putin's regime is a reactionary sort of Christian nationalist mystical regime. It's a gangster regime. It's clearly not one that we can give any degree of support for. And so I would argue, should be in favor of dual defeatism, of arguing for the defeat of both, of arguing that the working class has no interest in the victory of either, and that we should oppose both the regional expansionism of the Russian Federation and the position of the United States and its allies. Now, unlike 1914, when there had been a long growth of a socialist movement, of an organized working class in Europe, today the position of the international working class as an organized force is weak. The forces of Marxism, of revolutionary politics, are incredibly small. And to argue and to put forward that position may seem to be utopian. It may well be, comrades are going to argue, that it's pie in the sky to argue for a working class solution, that we have to take sides, either to defend the democracy the West or to attack the imperialism of America through support for Putin. Working class and militant working class politics are weak, but they certainly are not going to be strengthened in any way if we tie our wagon to either the defense of American imperialism or Putin's reactionary regime. So working class independence, I think, remains the key objective, a distinctive working class foreign policy, not one that relies upon sanctions or regime change by imperialist powers, not one that simply accepts that this is a war for democracy against tyranny, or a defense of Russia against American imperialism, but we actually see it for what it is, that it is the first of what I think will now be a series of great power wars, and that the world that even quite elderly people like myself have grown up in is now, in a sense, undergoing really quite fundamental change. And that change is one in which wars, economic crises of the sort that Roger began his introduction with, are going to become more and more prevalent. And in that position, merely calling for peace or merely backing one of the sides is not the solution. Linking the causes of war in capitalism, linking the causes of the war in imperialism, means that we have to take the socialist road and a real independent working class alternative. Anyway, comrades, I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you, Kevin. Before you go and before we open up for questions from the floor, and there are already quite a few people up with their hands up, we did call this meeting, the drive to World War III. In your view, though, is that a real prospect? And if so, what are they trying to achieve? I mean, somebody put it in the Q&A. Who would possibly win from a World War III, with potentially nuclear weapons, etc.?
Well, two questions. I think, first of all, it is a serious possibility. And I must say that that is something that's only, in a sense, dawned on me in the last 3 or 4 years. It's not something that I thought would be a possibility, partly because of the relative positions of China and the United States. If we look at this historically, and indeed American strategists are very fond of looking at the Thucydides trap and making the comparisons with Athens and Sparta in classical Greece, we often see that the pattern is for a hegemonic power, in this case the United States, to feel itself under threat and then to try to deal with that challenge. Now, the United States is clearly relatively weaker, but it is still absolutely the strongest power in the planet. And the balance of forces, I think, still favors the United States. But if this week's Economist is to be believed, the balance may well be shifting, and in particular, sections of the United States military believe that they might need to carry out some sort of preemptive action within the next 10 years. I mean, some are talking about a war as soon as 2025. And so I think that in those circles, it's certainly being discussed. And the phrase preventive war, you will recall from Germany, Tina, was one that the German High Command thought that a quick war, 6 or 7 weeks, I think they predicted, on the basis of the Franco-Prussian and Austro-Prussian wars. So people are talking about that. The other thing about the use of nuclear weapons is that, again, I think this is being raised quite seriously. Danny Finkelstein, the conservative peer, wrote an article last summer along the lines of, we have to talk about using nuclear weapons, as a serious possibility. So I think the dynamics of capitalist crisis and above all the imperialist rivalry do pose the question of a world war. The form that will take and whether, for example, there'll be a series of regional wars conducted through proxies, for example, Israel and Iran in the Middle East. The position of India, could be interesting here. What side it would move on. Again, the balance between India and China is shifting, and there can be some quite, interesting developments there as well. But in the current era, nuclear weapons are, I suppose, a very real possibility. And what we've learned from the conduct of this war is that the way that we thought wars were going to be conducted is not the way that this war has been conducted. It's had elements of the First World War, as well as some of the most up-to-date technologies of drones and so forth. But certainly the type of strategy that I think the United States is considering, and in response the Chinese are considering, does genuinely, to my mind, throw up the possibility of nuclear exchange. And certainly that's what American strategists are preparing for.
On that happy note, shall we open up? I mean, obviously it doesn't.
Well, you didn't ask me to cheer people up, Tina.
No, I didn't. And let's hope that if we get our act together and, the united working class internationally puts up some resistance, we don't fold like a house of cards like the Second International did. That was shocking as well. Okay, comrades, we've got loads of people with their hands up. Please try to be succinct and see if you have a particular question to any of our panelists, point it directly at the panelists. And our panelists, if you indicate to me if you want to come in, I can bring you in straight away. Otherwise, we'll bring you in at the end. John was the first person with his hand up. Hi, comrade.
Good afternoon, Tina, and thank you, Roger, Hannah, and Kevin, for your contributions. All very interesting. First of all, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. I'll just keep them brief, obviously. Roger talked about, as a road to peace, the need for Russia to immediately withdraw its forces from eastern Ukraine. And before that, he described the situation which immediately preceded the Russian move into Ukraine, which was that 130,000 armed forces Ukraine troops were stationed on the border of the Donbass. And it was partly because of that stationing of those troops ready to invade the Donbass that Russian forces were prompted to go in defense of those citizens in that region. And I'd like to ask Roger how he proposes if Russia withdraws from the eastern Ukraine, what will happen to the citizens in that area if Russia withdraws? Clearly, my worry is that the first thing that would happen is the Ukrainian forces would continue with the massacring of those people who would then be undefended. We have talk of possible peace solutions. My worry is that peace solutions with the West don't work. We saw in 2014 and 2015 the Minsk Accords. Those Minsk Accords, we were told, would involve Ukraine holding a neutral role, would not involve moving in NATO weapons up to the borders of Russia. But then Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande of this year told us that in actual fact, they never meant to force you or get Ukraine to keep to those agreements. They just saw it as an opportunity for the Ukraine armed forces to be made stronger, to use Merkel's words. So in such circumstances, how can Russia trust the West in any future peace deal that's not enforced by military methods? We're supposed to trust the West when it says we'll keep our agreements, when the last thing that the Western states did was to break such agreements. And I've seen videos online of Zelensky pulling faces while Vladimir Putin read out the terms of the Minsk Accords. Are we supposed to take these people seriously? Is Russia supposed to take these seriously? International diplomacy has to be built on trust. It has to be built on understanding of both sides and respect for both sides. I've been observing geopolitical issues for 60 years. And throughout that time, I'm amazed to find that we've suffered more censorship during this particular period than any other time throughout my life. And we've seen the demonization of the Russian president as in unbelievable amount. And it's disrespectful, and it does nothing towards bringing peace across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think we're going to collect a few questions, if that's okay, with the panelists, because there's a lot of people with a hand up now. Joanne, you've got your hand up, but I can't make you a panelist. Did you want to speak from the floor? We can hear you if you just want to speak. Joanne? Nope. Okay. Paul.
Yeah,
oh,
briefly.
Oh, okay, go on.
You can hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I missed a bit at the start because I had problems with me Bluetooth headphones as usual. I was going to make a point about imperialism, but I think Kevin Bean covered that very well. You know, to make this the distinction between the vulgar use of the word and the Leninist use of the word, which of course is tied into economic considerations. Personally, I don't regard China, either China or Russia, as currently imperialist. That within the world as it stands at the moment, it's America is by far the most by far the singular imperialist country from the point of view that it's the global hegemon. Attached to America, of course, is the EU and the old imperialist powers of Europe, France, Germany, and so forth, and of course the United Kingdom. On Belarus and Russia, I find Belarus in my opinion, is a kind of Bonapartist regime. I've watched with interest the opposition that's been in the limelight in Belarus, and come to the conclusion that these are either American stooges or that they're certainly not representatives of the left. Which brings me on to the point of the question of underground work. There must be within both Belarus and Russia secret cells of left oppositionists in those countries, and it's probably I think that's an essential ingredient in getting what we're calling for. That's like those regimes being overthrown from below, not by color revolutions or anything like that, but by workers' revolution in both these countries. Same goes for Ukraine. There must be underground left oppositionists, even small forces on the ground in Ukraine as well. So I think that's something important to take into consideration. Yeah, John Gibson made some points that were very constructive, and I think the entire webinar has been very, very constructive and very informative as a whole. The question of nuclear war, well, yeah, that's a possibility, but I think the scenario would be, because the use of nuclear weapons within the confines of Ukraine are likely, whoever uses them is likely to kill their own people. because of of course, the radiation involved. I think a more likely scenario would be a shooting war directly between Russia or China and the West, directed at cities in UK and in Russia, etc. I think that's the most likely and the most horrendous scenario, of course. So, you know, I'll leave my contribution there. Excellent job.
Thank you, comrade. Yes, I'm enjoying this meeting very much as well. Comrades, please try to be succinct if you can. I know this is a huge issue, but we've got, I think, 10 people with their hands up, and we are trying to get to everybody. So if you could make your point as quickly as possible. Hi, Paul.
Yeah, the Russian aims to me in not just this war, but in other situations are pretty modest. It seems to me that what Putin aims to do is to chip off bits of the non-Russian former Soviet states which have a Russian population. And you saw this in various places. You saw this in Moldavia with Transnistria and so forth, and also with Ossetia, with the war with Georgia. I think he's come unstuck with Ukraine because he assumed that the Russophone Ukrainians of the East and the South, who largely voted for pro-Russian candidates like Kuchma and Yanukovych, that their friendly attitude towards Russia historically and their voting for pro-Russian candidates would translate into being incorporated into Russia, like what happened in the Crimea. But of course that didn't happen, and in fact it's caused exactly the opposite. And so in that sense, it came a cropper. If you look at it in that sense that Putin wanted to take in the whole of the Donbass and the Black Sea littoral, then you can see why he sent the invasion force that he did. Because if he'd have had the Russophone Ukrainians on his side, that would have been perfectly adequate force to capture Kiev. But of course, things turn out differently. That, I think, is what Putin was going for. And this is a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union along what were no more than British county boundaries for all the importance of them in the Soviet Union. It didn't really matter where the border of Ukraine and Russia went, whether it was 50 miles this way or that way, because it is Moscow ran the show. It didn't matter really that the Crimea was shifted overnight from Russia into Ukraine in 1954, because, well, what difference did it make then? But when these become independent countries and what's equivalent to a county boundary becomes a national boundary, then when you've got large numbers of Russians out with Russia, and you get a government in Ukraine, such as that which came in, well, it was Yushchenko, first of all, and then the government that came in after the Maidan protests, which are making a chauvinistic definition of Ukrainian national identity, one that lionizes basically war criminals, fascist war criminals, such as Stepan Bandera. That is going to make Russians in Ukraine feel extremely unhappy. I think that's some of the historical basis for it. Just very briefly on the question of World War, some of the demands that are being put forward, especially by liberals, war crime trials for Putin. How are they going to get Putin in the dock? It would be like putting the former leaders of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the dock. And we know what that took. It took the complete military defeat of those countries and their occupation. These sort of things are basically accelerating the drive towards a major confrontation, because however much arms are put into Ukraine, its forces can't inflict on Russia that sort of demand. that these people are putting forward in the West. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, comrade. Marie.
Yeah, hello.
Hi. Oh,
Can you hear
yes.
me properly?
I think your internet is a bit choppy, but try.
Yeah, I haven't got connection. I think it's a very important discussion. I would addressing the speakers, a general.
Oh, Marie, I'm not sure this is going to work. We can hear about every fifth word.
But can I remove? Can I remove?
I switch off your video. That might improve. Try now.
Is that a bit better?
Yeah,
better?
I think it is. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I'll give it a go. Yeah.
Yes. Go on.
So the comrade from Belarus, I understand from what she said that there is in fact a large nationalized sector and state control sector in Belarus still in existence. And in my opinion, if I understood that correctly, do you still understand me? Is that still okay?
Yep.
Yeah. In my opinion, when you are advancing outside capitalism, first measure, you need state control. And then immediately also to obtain this, you need the mobilization of people to control the state. Now, I'm sure that we haven't got all that, but nevertheless, the fact that there is still a large nationalized sector in Belarus is testament to the fact that the process of getting out of capitalism is not finished. And it is in process, in fact, capitalism not only wants Russia and China crushed in order to improve its system or to make it survive, but it also wants to destroy all the remnants of private property, of state property. Private property is now at war, as we can see in this country. Privatization is at war with the public interest, and this is like that all over the world. So I would like to say to Comrade Hanna, I would like to say, is it not for your proposition of regime change, which is wanted already by the West and which nobody has denied? Speakers before me have mentioned that regime change is the intention of the United States, of the EU, and of capitalism as a whole. So seeing that this is the case, is it not inconvenient for you, Hanna, to pose the same slogan? Because then you will attract people who will not just be trade unionists, but who will disguise themselves as such and use your union in order to get Lukashenko removed in order to bring back private property. So that's what I wanted to ask and to say to the comrade. And then when it comes to this picture of Kevin, I think the same thing applies. It's not the case that Russia or China even are making big international consortiums based on private property and the profit-making competing with world imperialism at the level of finance. It's not like this. And so what's happening, in fact, that world finance has concentrated worldwide more or less in the hands of the United States and a few of its allies. And this now is at war. That financial sector is at war with the rest of humanity. And then you've got these banks going bankrupt, and we are told, oh, well, it's nothing, don't worry about it. And you can see that this system is not viable. And in any war, it's going to crack, because I don't believe they have the discipline, the financial strength, or even the morality to defeat the masses of the world. And so when I hear, I would like to say that as a conclusion for Kevin, when he sees that the war, you know, is going to be such a devastation, or, you know, it's not going to be just military. The war which is coming is social. And it is in fact about private property wanting to remain on the stage of history and failing. This is why now they use nuclear weapons. They have put nuclear weapons throughout Europe and in this country and in Lakenheath. And so I propose to the comrades that we should not idealize and mystify the war. The war is just the expression of the antagonism which are here and which none of us can stop except by organizing. So I agree that the working class needs international organization, but we are not going to do that with regime change in Belarus or even other countries like it. We are going to do it. Why not? Just one more sentence. Why not call for an international? There was a third international. Why not look for what's left of it and try to recuperate the forces there, which are communist, by the way, and then all the forces of the left, which are now extensive in the anti-war movements. Go for an international. This is what the solution is. Yeah.
Thanks, Marie. I think we might have differences of opinion about what the politics of that international would be, I get the impression. Hanna, before I bring you in as a comrade who can only stay for another 5 minutes, I'll take you after that, if that's okay, yeah? Paul, if you could come in now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Following from, well, how do I follow Marie for a start? I agree with a lot of what Marie said, to be honest. But going from the argument about no to NATO, no to Washington, no to Moscow, my issue with that is very much along the line that John Gibson said, and I would say it quite directly, that I do see it as a utopian position, I'm afraid. It's the political amicry of the SWP. It's not about supporting Russia or Ukraine so much. It's just about acknowledging the material reality of the ground. So by supporting the self-determination of these elements of Ukraine, I agree with Kevin to the extent that to some extent it is dishonest politics, because it's the stuff of the ideal world that we you know, you could get there once we've got a revolution, but along the way you've got to deal with the material reality on the ground. And you might say, well, that's not the working class revolution. Well, fine, but if Russia does actually manage to push back on NATO, my position is that for a little while at least, that puts the war on China, the plans for that will have gone for a burden. And the question of defeating NATO, but also it presents a chance of having a multipolar world where the US dollar doesn't have to be the reserve currency. Other countries will say, no, we want to work with such and such countries. But within that, the working class within those individual countries would be able to develop the forces that could take on their capitalists within those individual countries, and therefore form a working class bloc within those territories, and then expand the revolution in that way. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Hanna, would you like to reply now? Thank you.
Well, on the two questions, of the first question I see was the question whether there are any secret left cells in Belarus where the workers actually continue to fight. Well, the political landscape of Belarus is quite interesting, and not everyone understands it. Well, the thing about Belarusian political parties is that those parties which were truly oppositional, they, excuse me, they have been basically removed from the political stage. Those leaders who managed to escape to the West did so. Others are in prison. There are left political parties. There is the Belarusian claiming to be socialist party, which is called the Fair World, to translate it from Russian. Then there is the Green Party, and there is the party which is called Gramada, or the people, basically. These parties are not active at the moment. And I mean, de jure, there are parties, but they are afraid to move because nobody understands these days what you can do and not to be arrested for it. So, and nobody wants to go to prison. Hence, there's the Belarusian parliament has been working on the law, on new law on political parties. And according to that law, most of the opposition parties will be closed. They will just cancel them. And what would happen is that there are parties which are being organized right now. And these are pro-authoritarian parties. They are pro-government. They are, some of them are basically, well, appointed left parties. And such as, for example, the party which is called the Belarus, which is White Russia, basically. And this party was appointed to be a pro-worker, pro-socialist party. And then what will happen, that's what we think will happen, is that de facto there will be one pro-government party, which will be split into 2 or 3 to create the nice scenery of, you know, oh, yes, there is opposition, great. So, and this is, have a look, this is the right opposition, this is opposition on the left, etc. So then that's what will happen. Lukashenko is not going to just say, oh, well, there are no political parties. He has to, you know, he has to maintain the image. Okay, even a totalitarian regime needs to maintain the image. And so, but these are all just decorations. That there are no left underground cells in the country. People are too scared. During the protests of 2020 and after that, there were workers' cells, yes, there were strike committees at enterprises, which were very brutally repressed. People are either imprisoned or they left the country. Those people who we now see, oh, well, the people claim to have blown up a plane somewhere on the one of the Russian spy planes, but those just people who got together, and they're not politically affiliated to anyone. So as for the question with the nationalized property, well, in Belarus, nationalization doesn't mean socialism. It's not worker controlled. It is controlled by the government, and it acts as Lukashenko private fund. So de jure, all those companies are private. They're all joint stock companies, closed joint stock companies, open joint stock companies. any variety of joint stock companies, and the government is basically one of the shareholders, just the biggest one. So it's not nationalization in the sense that we used to.
Thank you, comrade, for clarifying that. Okay, comrades, we were trying to finish with contributions from the floor about 7:45 so that we can bring the speakers back for 5 minutes each. So please try to make your points quickly. Steve, please.
Yes, thank you, comrades. I'll try to be as quick as I can. First of all, I support the struggle of the Ukrainian people, and I support the struggle in the Ukraine, especially the Ukrainian working class, for democracy and against occupation and against the partition by military force of their country. So I start from that point of view. As far as Russia is concerned, I take the view, definitely take the slogan, neither Washington nor Moscow. I can see that's an element of imperialism in that. There are no pure imperialist wars of mass slaughter. You get democratic movements from below when you get imperialist wars. So, for example, in 1916, the war between Germany and Ireland and Britain led the way to the Irish uprising. There was an attempt to in Easter 1916, the Easter uprising. And of course, Germany, they were trying to get arms from Germany. The Germans saw it, what a fantastic opportunity to destabilize British imperialism by supplying arms to the Irish rebels. That's always going to happen. Imperialism is always going to interfere in any struggle of people. Same thing, of course, happens, of course, in Russia in 1917, a war between the Russian state and the German state. From below comes a democratic movement, comes a democratic revolution, becomes a democratic republic because of the oppression. So democracy, the struggle for democracy, is always inherent in inter-imperialist wars. So what we would be looking at, if we were looking at Ukraine, we'd be looking at the forces of democracy within Ukraine. And I don't mean by democracy in Ukraine, the existing state. The argument is for a democratic republic in Ukraine. And the same argument can be made that, and I agree with this slogan, the main enemy in the UK is the British Crown. But I want to make one point too. Now, I won't wind me up, but I want to come to the point about Belarus, which was the key, I think the key thing all is. I don't believe that Ukraine can win this war because it's locked into a defensive position by imperialism and by Russia. It won't be. It's not allowed to attack Russia by America, UK, Germany. They don't want that to happen. Trotsky pointed out that war is political. And when Franco was in Morocco, ready to bring over his Moroccan army to invade southern Spain, Trotsky called on the Republican government to declare the Spanish colony independent because he realized that that would destabilize the whole of Franco's attempt to invade Spain. So at one stroke, he would have divided Franco's army. Now we have to think of Ukraine in Belarus in the same way. What the Ukrainians should do, what the Ukrainian working class should do, is they should support the people in Belarus. They should work to help the Belarusian working class overthrow the regime there by going in that direction and not waiting on NATO weapons to come, be supplied by imperialism under the control of imperialism, of course, and the industry. That I guess it's not going to happen because that will not be allowed to happen unless you have some sort of radical change in Ukraine itself. But if we're looking for a strategy, okay, a strategy that links the Ukrainian working class to the Belarusian working class would be a huge step forward to end that war. Otherwise, it's a slaughterhouse that we're watching.
Apologies for rushing you along. It's just we still have seven people with their hands up. It's very difficult. So, comrades, I have to cut you all down for 2 minutes each, I'm afraid. Agnes, please.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, you all know that Ukraine as a nation didn't exist until 2018. So I just like to make 3 snippets within my 2 minutes. Bartók collected music there, folk songs in that area, and he diligently marked all the songs: Russian song, Ruthenian song, Hungarian song, Moldovan song. There wasn't such a thing as Ukrainian. And then fast forward, I'd like to mention that I have a friend in Budapest who is apolitical, leaning more to the right, if there is anything. She studied at the university in Kiev, and she keeps saying she did not study in the Ukraine, she studied in the Soviet Union. And the last thing is that since 2014, but especially nowadays, the Hungarians in the Ukraine are very much attacked. They're not allowed to use their language, this and that. There are 200,000 of them. So when people say they support the self-determination of the Ukrainian people, I'd like to know which bit of the Ukrainian. Are the 200,000 Hungarians included in that, or how does it work? So I hope I wasn't longer than 2 minutes.
You were shorter even, and made some interesting points. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you.
Okay, Marian and Anthony, please. You've got 4 minutes.
Shall I speak first? Yes.
Can I just say, I think this is unacceptable. We have a distinct position that has not been aired anywhere tonight, and this has happened more than once in other situations, and I just don't think it's fair that a lot of people have had many, many more minutes. And in my hands have been up a long time, and if we're talking about democracy, there should be a case where people that don't have any other position that's been expressed should have an opportunity
I have no idea what your position is, Marianne. I've been taking people as they come. It's 20 people, over 20 people had their hands up. So do you want to use your time now, please, comrade?
Yes, you speak first, Tony.
I think the main point I want to defend is the worker state analysis and the political revolution. What we have in United Front with the Broxy is against mass privatisation, mass cost of the social services. You got that under the Yeltsin when the Broxy had those pressures. But what we do fight for is political revolution against the bureaucrats' pillage. Like you defend the trade union when you got right-wing bureaucrats leading strike, you wouldn't attack the bureaucrats when they find the capitalists in the United Front situation. There's been erosion of the capitalists, but what they're trying to do, and these people are not Democrats, they're using every force from the liberals to the fascists to overthrow the property relations in Ukraine. So what are you going to do if the West wins that? How's that mass privatization? People are not as naive as they make out in this meeting. The Russian and Chinese blocs are putting their line under the sun. They're not going to give up to the capitals, and we all could be dead. And because of this disorientation, we haven't been able to build an effective anti-war movement and deal with being over it. There's a lot of the Stalinist period, but the big part, we live in an imperialist country, and the whole movement's been paralysed. If we don't get reassessment, we'll all be dead.
And I just want to say, democracy is key, but equally, if we're going to turn this around, we have to realise who the real enemy is at this particular junction. I think Roger and both Roger said and Kevin said that Russia had been provoked into this. But the same is happening in North Korea. The same is happening in China. And when the West say, Sunak said it again yesterday, there's a world of difference between what Russia, China stand for and what we in the West stand for. And when they say they want the existing world order to continue, that's what I oppose. I oppose the existing world order. I want to smash capitalism, and I want a political revolution in those countries that are transitional societies still, that haven't completely been taken back into capitalism. And we need a political revolution in those countries because it's for the working class in the West and in the East to overthrow the bureaucracy in the East through a political revolution, and it's for us in the West to actually have a socialist revolution. And if you want peace, the only way you're going to get it is to overthrow capitalism and imperialism and actually develop to a fully socialist society. And you can't do that if you capitulate. And a lot of the left supported going into Libya. Oh, you know, they're freedom fighters. What's the state of Libya today? It's no more democratic. It's a load of warring factions. There's no society there at all. None of the left have drawn the balance sheet on that either. So if you want peace, if you want the world not to be destroyed by nuclear weapons, then you have to actually understand the real dynamics.
Thank you, comrade. That was quite right. Within capitalism, you can't have peace. It's only ever a war with different methods being used, as Clausewitz said. Thank you, comrade. John Ralph, please.
Okay, thanks, Tina. And thanks for organising this meeting. Just on some points in terms of imperialism, I do think that both China and Russia are emerging imperialist powers. Why do I say that? Because Kevin, who's an old friend of mine, said it's a regional, expanding regionally. But when you look at what they're doing across the world, in Syria, the Yemen, Libya, Sudan, Mozambique, Central African Republic, the Congo, they are in there. The Wagner Group is there under oligarch control, etc., and the contractors are. So I think they're expanding. If you say it's a regional power, you've got to say it's an international power, because it's in many different continents today. And of course, China is even more so. So I think it's a point. But of course, I'm trying to keep to the 2 minutes. It's very clear for me what happened in the Ukraine when Putin decided to invade, and the Ukrainianization of the Ukraine. In other words, he wanted to destroy the Ukraine, and they were prepared to retreat and so on. But I think what happened, what surprised everybody in the world, was the strength of the working class, the independent unions fighting in Ukraine around Kryvyi Rih. And I'm not just talking here and reading the books. We're part of an international movement of trade unions that have been mobilizing to go into the Ukraine, Workers' Aid for Ukraine. We made the decision in Dijon with unions from 39 countries and 100 different trade unions. And some of those unions are instrumental in fighting for the general strikes at this moment in France. There are others in Spain, there are some in Poland. So there was an international working class effort. And we have also comrades in Belarus. And I was very, very interested to hear what Hanna had to say. And also from our trade union movement here, we want to express solidarity with the independent unions against the repression, against the jailing. And if these countries are not capitalist, then why are they jailing so many of the oppositionists who are trying to build their own independent trade unions? I think there's a huge thing to answer there. And also, one of the leaders we're talking to is Yuri Samolov from Kryvyi Rih, and I'll finish on this point, that actually said that they had, their miners' union had 52,000 members in the Donbass area. And when the Russians invaded, 8 of their leaders were killed, others were arrested. So you have that kind of fight that's going on. I think in the Ukraine, only the working class can resolve this issue against this Russian invasion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, comrade. Russell, please.
Thanks, Tina, and thank you to the speakers. Given that we're pressed for time, I'll have to try and think how to condense what I want to say. I suppose the important observation I would like to make is that this conflict in Ukraine has in fact thrown up incredible paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes that I would like to throw to the speakers is, irrespective of how you want to characterize Russia, the fact is Russia, in its current geopolitical position, offers both material, diplomatic, and moral support to anti-imperialist struggles like in Cuba, like in Venezuela, like in Nicaragua. And most of the world is actually looking for Russia to win this conflict, because most of the world are victims of colonialism and imperialism. And that's why the idea that Russia is isolated is complete nonsense. Okay, and the last thing I would like to expand a lot more, but the last thing I want to say, which is something that I can't believe is not really factored into any type of analysis of what's going on. Russia is not just any old country. Russia is a nuclear power armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. The US Director of National Security has already briefed the US government, Avril Haines, saying the circumstances under which Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons is if it felt it was losing. Right. So with that in mind, the idea that we should be supporting Ukraine to defeat Russia seems to me totally crazy, totally mad.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Matthew, please.
Yeah, charge through the world in 2 minutes. Right, okay, I think just to be very quick, the point is here that as far as I can see, Russia isn't imperialist, but we should support neither side. And Russia is basically run by a bunch of gangsters and looters. But the question is, what is the interest of the working class and the interest of the working class? In our terms, I mean, obviously what's happening now is the lineup in Europe, of course, is to basically divert money away from, to crush down living standards to support this war. And it is becoming a direct question of that. Plus, at the same time, under conditions in which China, and there is a debate whether or not China is imperialist, because I mean, if you see the role of China in Africa and so on, it's much more extensive than Russia and much more, much more classically imperialist, actually. So there's a debate on the nature of China. But the thing is that China has been the world's largest manufacturing country since 2010. And the Americans are basically promoting a war against China. There's no question. I mean, one of the senior American generals has actually said there will be a war within the next 2 years. And all his guys should get their wills sorted out because they're going to go to war, and lots of them will get killed. It's that naked. And there's then, the whole question, you start to get debate in all these countries and all these people say, well, look, we need to spend loads of money on arms and we're not going to, basically, we're going to crush down world living standards in order to pay for World War III. And the question really is what we've got now, obviously, is the strike movement and so on, talking about money and the rest of it. But we need to say, look, part of this is the fact that one, there is this war going on and we need to get that stopped. And two, they intend to start another one, which is even bigger and even worse. And they intend for us to pay for that, both in blood and in money. And that's pretty central in terms of the position of the working class. And really, that's a key question we should be raising. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely, exactly 2 minutes. Thank you, Matthew. Well done. I should say on Thursday in our session on why Marx, we are discussing the nature of Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc. So we'll hopefully have a bit more time to continue this discussion. Tony, please, the last speaker from the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chin. I mean, my position is also distinctive. Firstly, in response to Steve Freeman, I'm really not surprised that you advocate a social imperialist perspective, indeed an imperialist perspective. I think it's quite clear to me that the class character of the Russian regime is absolutely irrelevant. Let me quote Trotsky. Let us assume, however, that on the morrow England enters into a military conflict with Brazil, which he described as semi-fascist. I ask you, on whose side of the conflict will the working class be? I will answer for myself personally. In this case, I will be on the side of fascist Brazil, inverted commas, against democratic, inverted commas, Great Britain. It really is irrelevant that Putin is a gangster and so on and so forth. This is a NATO proxy war, and Kevin's quite correct. I think we are seeing the beginning of World War III. And who is instigating it? It is US imperialism, which is the overwhelmingly dominant military hegemon. And in that case, it is clearly a defensive war. It's irrelevant if Russia struck first, even if we think it did strike first, because there's been a war going on in the Donbass for the last 8 years. We have to wake up to the reality of the AUKUS Pact, the war on China that they are projecting, and of course, human obliteration if we ever did get into a nuclear war. So I really think we need to wake up. And Marxism isn't just doctrine, it's a means of analysis and understanding. Why has NATO expanded up to the borders of Russia? It clearly wants a breakup, and this is openly argued of the Russian Federation as part of the encirclement of China. 800 military bases that the United States has. And to characterize this as an inter-imperialist war is fundamentally mistaken. Russia's demands were terribly imperialist. They were for a neutral Ukraine, for Ukraine not to be a member of any military pact. That to me doesn't sound particularly imperialist. The question of whether Russia's imperialist elsewhere is for another day, but I don't believe it is. It doesn't have the character of imperialism. It's primarily a raw materials exporter, gas and oil. It doesn't export capital. It actually exports money via the oligarchs. It's a completely different economic understanding. And Lenin was quite clear when he said, and I could quote, only in this sense, he said, if tomorrow Morocco were to declare war on France, India on England, Persia or China on Russia and so forth, those would be just defensive wars, inverted commas, irrespective, and he emphasized that, of who attacked first. Even if we accept that Russia invaded first, and there's a big question mark on it, this is a defensive war. And so I am opposed to any demand now for Russia to withdraw its troops. I think what Putin did was a mistake, and he fell into Biden's trap. But having done that, the situation has changed. And for Russia to withdraw now would be a victory for NATO, which they would then utilize to go on to wage war against China. We know that. They declare it openly. So I really do think people have to make some sense of the present situation and not simply look at today in terms of the First World War. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Very interesting points. I'll let you go on a bit longer, you might have noticed. Yes, comrades, it's been a very interesting debate. And of course, this reflects the seriousness of the situation we're in. We will continue to have these open debates. We can't solve it obviously here, but it is important that the left gets its heads around what is going on and what the right positions should be. Roger first, 5 minutes, then Hannah and Kevin Bean to sum up. It's been quite a well-attended meeting also as well, up to 80 people in the meeting. It's been very good. Roger first, please.
Well, I think it's been a really very, very stimulating discussion. And I think we all need that because we're in uncharted territory. This is a situation that has arisen that is, you can't always find historical precedents that will give you all the answers. You can't look up a textbook, and we're all feeling our way. And I certainly, I listened with great interest to the contributions of other comrades, and I'm just making my own contribution to trying to collectively get some kind of sense of what a revolutionary position ought to be. Now, just to take some of the points that came up. First of all, Comrade raised the early in the discussion about the threat of nuclear war. Now, nuclear war is, of course, the great nightmare hanging over all of us. But I don't believe that that any rational leader, if you like, whether we talk about Biden or Putin, or I don't believe that Putin is irrational. I believe it's entirely rational what he's doing from his own interests and the interests of his regime. I don't believe that anybody is plotting or planning nuclear war, but that's not the way things go. Nuclear war would arise out of a progression of a conflict, and in particular, no rational leader is going to decide that their policy is for a nuclear war. But it doesn't work like that. I don't believe that Putin would launch a nuclear war. But if Putin is overthrown, for instance, there are some horrible, sinister people around, Prigozhin of the Wagner group. I think if thuggish fascist elements like him came to power in Russia, or into a fragmented Russia, one fragment of it or something, I don't rule out the possibility that it could lead to an all-out conflagration, which would be a nightmare for humanity. Now, John raised the question about how can we call for Russian withdrawal from Donbass. You see, what we can do as revolutionaries and socialists is only to say what would be the only rational outcome of the conflict as they arise. We're not in power. We're not in a situation where we can determine how our solutions are going to be implemented. What we have to say is our program is for the working class. We have to say, and there's no shortcut to it. We have to win the working class to our ideas in Russia, in Ukraine, in America, in Britain. That's the only, otherwise we're in a losing game where there is no solution. If you say, well, yes, but how can there be self-determination in Donbass? How can the Russians withdraw and so on? But we don't start with that. We start with what are the interests of the working class. The only program, the only rational way out of it, the only democratic way out of it comes to that is for the peoples of the areas of conflict to decide for themselves what outcome they would like. And we are in favor of self-determination for the people. We're in favor of self-determination for the people of West Ukraine, that they have the right to run their own affairs without interference and without the threat of invasion. So also for the peoples of the eastern Ukraine and of Crimea. It's not for anybody else except the people themselves to decide what their status ought to be. On the question of, which is obviously a fundamental thing about the nature of imperialism, I do believe that it's that the correct classification or definition of Russia is as a minor, secondary, regional imperialist power. There are many imperialist powers in their own spheres of influence. So I think that you could take countries like India and like South Africa and like Brazil and so on as regional imperial powers within their own spheres of influence. And I think that is the correct definition of Russia. There are, by the very definitions of imperialism that Lenin designated, I believe that they fit all those categories: the concentration of capital in monopolies, the centralization of capital ownership with finance capital, the to a certain extent the export of capital, and within certain corners, if you like, of an attempt to repartition the markets in their favor. All those sort of things I could give, if there were more time, I could justify that. But the point is, I mean, let's get to the point we do not want to see a victory of American imperialism. They are, of course, the main enemy because they are the strongest imperial power, and our duty is to fight for the defeat of our own capitalist powers. So that, I mean, there's no question of our siding with the Zelensky regime or with the Biden regime or with the Sunak regime. There's no question of that. But we have to put forward a proper vision of what our solution is or what we are campaigning for. We're talking about a victory of either side is a disaster. A victory of either side would be a catastrophe. The only solution and the only goal that we can fight for is socialist revolution on a global scale. Our enemy is the capitalist class at home as our contribution to the victory of socialism worldwide. And we certainly do not want to give any indication that we favor the horrible, degenerate gangster regime of Russia, a parasitic excrescence founded on the plunder of the assets of the old Soviet states and so on. But that is not our main enemy. Our enemy, it begins at home. It's our fight for the socialist revolution in Britain. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roger. Hanna, do you want to come back to a few things that were raised in the discussion?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Tuna, for the invitation. It was a really interesting webinar. Well, the thing that was one of the comrades mentions this: why would people in totalitarian countries, why would they, if they are not capitalist as they claim to be, why would they arrest leaders of the opposition? Well, with respect to Belarus, it is capitalist. It's in a way a form of capitalist authoritarian dictatorship. It's the man is for himself. He's not. I don't think he has a particular ideology in mind. Never has had any. And being a dictator, any dictator, especially the one who is very much pro-capitalist, he would be afraid of any worker opposition, and that's what he does. And the people who he jailed, some of them, he considers his own personal enemies. The only thing they did ever was to stand against him in defending workers' rights, in trying to defend unfair legislation, in trying to protect those who had no protection from the state or had no protection from the official unions, which what they were supposed to do. So that's why people were jailed, and that's why this regime will continue. He will continue to stand with Russia because he has no choice. But at the same time, I mean, he's indebted to Russia, deeply, deeply indebted. But at the same time, he will start playing with the West because he is afraid of the West as well. He's sits between the two very hot plates at the moment. So, and maybe there is a way to influence that kind of person enough to, for example, for us to at least get our comrade back. There will be strive for war because that war wasn't started now. I do agree that it's been quietly burning, slowly burning under the surface for quite some time. Now it's all out in the open, and it will progress unless something will be done to stop it. But right now, at this particular point, I just don't see what. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hanna, and thank you for your input into this discussion. Been very useful. Okay, Kevin, if you would like to reply to a few points to sum up.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. I'd like to sort of make the jumping off point, something that Matthew said about the impact of the war throughout Europe and indeed throughout the world. the question of food supplies coming from Ukraine, the question of energy, the question of the German economy, and of course the impact of the war on us here in terms of armament spending and the proposals to increase spending on war. That means that this is not just some sort of esoteric discussion of global strategy. Someone noted that we're all civilians, and that's true. But as Clausewitz said, as Tina quoted him, that war is the continuation of policy by other means. And should there be any sort of wars, we can all be assured that, well, I'm a little too old now to be caught up, but I'm sure that my children and grandchildren, and indeed a lot of the younger comrades here, will be called up. In other words, that it's far too serious to be left as strategists, or indeed just to, rely upon slogans. We have to think about this as an urgent piece of practical politics, which is why the campaign against the war is linked to all sorts of other campaigns and all sorts of other aspects of our socialist politics. I think there has been a tendency, as someone who follows the left press, there has been a tendency to sort of think of this as, quote, foreign affairs, and that the real battle is the strike wave and so on, important as that is, or indeed that, there are bigger issues. I don't think there is a bigger issue than war and peace. But war and peace is not distinct from capitalism and imperialism. And to try to put it into the realms of simply arguing for peace, as many pacifists do, Stop the War Coalition and so on, really takes it out of that context. Now, I don't think any comrade here tonight has really done that, even comrades that I disagree with. And I think it is important for us to stress that this war is the product of great power rivalry, which is rooted in capitalism and imperialism. It's certainly rooted in the declining position of the American capitalist hegemon, and it's certainly rooted in the regional conflicts. And we cannot divorce it from capitalism. We can't simply say that it is a question of peace. Peace is an abstraction without looking at what causes the war, and that, of course, is intimately political in that way. The real dynamics, I think, of this war lie not only in the Donbass, in the Russian near abroad, and in the eastward expansion of NATO. They don't solely lie in the series of broken agreements and the provocations carried out by NATO, or indeed in the immediate aims of American imperialism for Russia. And Tony expressed those quite well. And I referred to them in my opening remarks as well, in terms of dismemberment, partition, turning Russia into, essentially a producer of raw materials that can then be exploited by America and by the West. There are other factors as well, and if we leave the Chinese one to the end, that's the important dynamic. There are also relationships between America and its allies. For example, the role of the European Union. The Americans have taken this opportunity to draw the more recalcitrant members of that union closer towards America and towards NATO. Germany has reoriented its policy significantly. The German ruling class has been brought to heel. So we have a whole series of rivalries and conflicts caught up in this situation. Indeed, Agnes, who talked about the situation in Transcarpathia, and I think the presence of about 140,000 Hungarian speakers. I saw a picture of Orban wearing a scarf, and on that scarf, it's a sort of ultra-nationalist football fan scarf. He has not only included Transylvania, those sections of the old Hungarian component of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he also includes Western Ukraine, particularly the area around Lvov. So we've got there a whole series of national rivalries and tensions. And what I think we're entering into in Europe, in the continent which for much of the post-World War was regarded as the national question, and these rivalries had been settled. We're seeing the revival of this, and that is a product of capitalist crisis. It's a product of the disintegration of particular blocks, but the emergence of new blocks. So we are, I think, moving into a period of wars, and of course that overarching rivalry in which all of these other rivalries can be framed is, of course, that between the United States and China. That's not just a sort of, catchphrase. That's not just a sort of neat way of putting together a whole disparate set of phenomena. We can look at those phenomena as separate. We can, for example, focus on rivalries in Eastern Europe. We can focus just on the question of the Donbass. But I don't think it makes sense without really understanding the nature of capitalism and imperialism and the type of global rivalries that are going to be thrown up. I don't regard the years before 1914 as some sort of blueprint or some sort of pattern as to what will occur. It will, of course, take a different form. And the different form, of course, is that China and its relative position and its relationship with America does differ from that of Britain and Imperial Germany. The geopolitics are different. The relative positions on the globe, the nature of their weapon systems, and above all, the presence of nuclear weapons, which does, pose the question of quite strong, quite severe impacts on humanity. The First World War was a barbarous war, and it threw up horrors that people couldn't really have foreseen. We can foresee the horrors that a nuclear war would throw up. When I talked in my opening about nuclear war, I was thinking of that as primarily an option for a future war between China and the United States and its allies. I don't, for example, think that it is very likely to, other than some possible tactical uses, which I think are very, very unlikely in the Ukraine. But I do think, for some of the reasons that comrades have pointed out, that US strategists are considering a military solution as part of their containment strategy. And even if they're not actively thinking about a preventive war, the strategy of containment certainly poses that. And just to reiterate, that is not just some sort of abstraction. That's not just something that is kept behind the pages of The Economist or the American Journal of Foreign Affairs. It's not just for the interests of armchair generals. It actually has direct political effects on the working class and the working class globally. And so our response has to be that of the international working class, what is in the interests of the international working class. And that's certainly not to back American imperialism. It's not to back Putin's regime. It is, in fact, the policy of fighting for the defeat of international capitalism. Capitalists at home are our real enemy, and that's where we begin. But we do nobody any favors if we separate the immediate struggles of the working class with what's happening from this wider geopolitical context. It shapes our lives, it shapes our politics, and we have to take an active position on it. It's not something we can avoid.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, comrades. I think that was a really wide-ranging debate, but I think Kevin and Roger summed up at least the sort of majority position that exists on the LLA. The discussion clearly showed that there's a lot of other positions out there, but it's important to discuss them out and hear the views. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us. Thank you, Hanna, for coming along as an outside speaker. Very enjoyable to hear your view. Enjoyable, interesting, I should say, that's the right phrase. Comrades, if you are interested in discussing the nature of the Soviet Union, China, etc., please come along to the Why Marx series this Thursday, where we're discussing exactly that. On Saturday, we're going to have a look at the Gary Lineker scandal, which is now sort of died down, but it's certainly shed some light of some very interesting aspects around free speech, cancel culture, media bias, etc., etc. We want to discuss some of these issues, what free speech means, for example, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of different views on that issue as well, as usual. Thank you, comrades. See you again Thursday, Saturday, perhaps some other time. Bye-bye, comrades.
Bye, comrades. Bye.